To some extent, I'm going to quickly summarize what we've just been hearing about. What's the problem? Well, the problem of non-communicable diseases is not new. This is no shock. It's been known for a long time. You can read these slides afterwards. But essentially, the evidence has been building up for 40 years, heavily over the last 40 years. But it's coming to a crunch around this New York meeting next month because essentially we've got a gap between evidence and policy. The WHO has been championing it since the 1980s, jointly with FAO for about 10 years, really since the global strategy on diet, physical activity, and health came into place in 2003, 2010, pulled together heavily by Derek Yak, our last speaker today. But I really want to argue, because I'm speaking to IFPRI in a literate audience, that I think we've got to have some pretty honest talking. I think there's a lot of vacuous thinking going on at the moment. And if we're honest, non-communicable diseases haven't been taken seriously as a developing country food and farming issue. It's been seen as Western, rich society problem. And partly that's for good intellectual reasons, because frankly, it muddies the policy thinking. For a long time, I'll come to this in a moment, thinking has been that the developing world just needs to produce more food. The next slide, I hope you've got my slide 4. Our chair very elegantly summarized it, the latest 2008 data in the report, the Global Status 2011 report that came out a few months ago from the World Health Organization. She summarized it very nicely. Here it is. If you didn't have it already, I thought I'd better put it in. NCDs cause 63% of deaths in the world. 80% of those NCD deaths, so 80% of the 63 were in low and middle incomes. It's no longer a problem just of the rich. I was brought up in India as a child, and one of my home cities, Bombay, now Mumbai, has the second highest rate of diabetes in the world, diabetes type 2. This is not just the rich world. It's about India getting richer, of course. And the 4 risk factors that are common to much of this are there. Our chair said it. In the WHO report, they moot some solutions. I hate it, but they used the phrase best buy. I think it's trivial, that sort of thinking, but here it is. This is the sort of things they suggested. It is very obvious things. Again, Derek was the architect of some of the really fabulous work from WHO on the global framework, which is still playing out on smoking. Many of us argue we need a global framework in the same way around food and diet, but it's more difficult with food because there's no bad food in the same way. And WHO has struggled, I think, with trying to come up with a list. Some of them, very easy ones, but even those are difficult, are reducing salt intake, which would be magnificent. And when you look at the WHO report, they start talking about some other issues, and there are long lists, and I've pulled out some in my right-hand column here, and they enter into very dangerous territory of restricting marketing of foods and soft drinks. Well, I mean, Derek now works for PepsiCo. Is PepsiCo really going to accept restrictions on soft drinks? But actually, that's probably what we need. We need to drink water, not Pepsi. So we're into difficult terrain, unlike tobacco, where it's pretty clear-cut. And even there, look, it's taken 50, 60 years to start getting weak controls on the problem. But now we've got the UN high-level meeting, 8 years after the World Health Reports, that's WHR's, of 2002, 2003. People like me welcome this meeting next month. It's fabulous. It's fabulous that IFPRI is engaging with it. But it's after 7 years of basically failure of the global strategy to have much leverage. So skeptical, but I hope sensible academics like me are saying, oh dear, have we got another case of a mismatch here between evidence and policy? There's always talk in my world of evidence-based policy. The reality is you have countless issues in food where you've got evidence looking for a policy or vast gaps between evidence and policy. Already we're seeing huge lobbying going on. Some of this summarized and led to a Lancet editorial a couple of weeks ago. Okay, now what's driving the food world? This is the sort of stuff I work on. Your chair very kindly referred to some of my writings with my colleagues. I want to be very simple. In the Food Wars book, Mike Heisman and I argued that, look, if you look at rural sociology and a lot of the brilliant work from social scientists, they've come up with this thinking about productivism. We argued, Mike Heisman and I, actually there's a productionist paradigm which is locked into health. And it goes back to very good evidence of the 1930s, the Boydors, the Cathcarts, really big thinkers and big researchers in public health nutrition. And they essentially argued this case in the 30s, got nowhere, but World War II gave them an opportunity. Boydor, as I'm sure you know, ended up as the first significant Director General of FAO. And the case was this, that science plus capital with improved distribution would increase output of food. And as long as we dealt with waste, then primarily at the farm, bad storage, microbiological contamination, you deliver cheaper food by getting more food, and that would be the means for improving health, because the problem was underproduction, underconsumption, maldistribution. It's a terribly simple social formula. And here they are. I put this photo up. Here they are, white, middle-class males, both smoking. Spot the doctor on the left. One of the all-time greats in food policy, John Boydor, there he is, a Dour Scot from the northeast of Scotland. The older he got, he ended up terribly august, Nobel Prize, etc., etc., but he became more and more radical as he got older. Sicko Mansholt on the right, a lovely, benign farmer from the Netherlands, who ended up creating the biggest food policy in the world, the Common Agricultural Policy. I met him towards the end of his life, and he used to say to me and others, I didn't expect it to end up with this. They were disappointed men when they ended their lives because their dream of that simple formula really was already coming unstuck. And this is why they addressed and that huge mid-19th century science capital, chemistry, early biological understanding, unleashed the productive capacity of land, addressed the Malthusian problem, but, and look at those bullet points, it was oil-based. Oil drove not just the distribution, but the fertilizers, replacing human and animal labor by tractors. It's mined the environment. I mean, the biodiversity, you IFPRI people, you know it even as well as I do. It assumed, however, that more food is good for health, not that we're in a world where there's over, mal, and under consumption side by side, sometimes in the same country, in the same household, in the same village. They assumed a rational model. They assumed that ever more choice is a public good in economic terms. And they said the issue is to be addressed on the farm. And this has completely been sidelined by the shift in the food system over the last 50 years, which has moved power and influence and indeed profitability from the farm to off the farm to traders, processors, but now primarily retailers. It's retailers who control and traders who control the world food system in the 21st century. And my good friend Jeff Rayner, who Derek knows too, and I are fans, how can we not be, of Barry Popkin and the nutrition transition argument. But actually nutrition transition isn't just a nutrition problem, it's a cultural problem. The social aspirations that people in Africa and Asia and Latin America are aspiring to eat differently. I mean, who are we in the West to say that's not a good thing, but it's leading to enormous burdens on nature, on the planet, and on NCDs. the role of the consciousness industries. When do I ever hear anyone in farming talk about marketing, advertising, media? We call them the consciousness industries. And the notion of waste has moved from on the farm, where it's still a big problem in many countries in the developing world. But in my country, for example, my government body that I was close to, RAP, for the British government, by the British government, has calculated we now throw away 1/3 of the food that we consumers purchase in a perfectly fit state to eat. There's an overproduction problem, not actually an underconsumption and underproduction. So we've got a more complex world. And 10 years ago, this sort of data was there already. Even as consumers were being told to cut down on fat, to eat more sensibly, look at what was happening. The overproduction of dairy and overproduction of fat was out of control and in a mismatch with the public health data and evidence. Jeff Rayner and I are about to produce, we've just finished a huge sort of lifetime's work in a book about to come out called Ecological Public Health, where we're arguing that the new agenda of the 21st century is essentially dealing with not just the nutrition transition, but 8 mega transitions, all of which muddy the problems for public health and agriculture. Okay, so what do we need in this complex world? Gone are the simplicities that those charming, benign, clever 1930s and 40s and 50s thinkers and movers and shakers, the world that they argued, just produce more food, unleash science, unleash capital, distribute food better, support farmers to produce more. This is a crazy, oversimplified formula. And yet we're seeing it again emerging. We need to have one last heave and unleash biotechnology and it'll all be all right. Whoa, that's ignoring consumption and these social dynamics that I'm alluding to. I'm a policy watcher. My colleagues and I here at City University in London, we watch this. And in one very simple slide, we summarize this as the current battle. There's a battle going on of 5 policy positions. Bury your head in the sand. There's nothing to do. Don't let markets work. The neocon position. There's a softer version, pragmatic business as usual. Let's put a bit more focus on consumers, give them a bit more information, tweak it a bit. And then there's a very interesting world, Derek and I were talking about it, he's in one bit of it actually, of where beneath the radar, not telling consumers, big changes going on, Pepsi reducing salt and sugar in bits of its products, but keeping its marketing going, Unilever, as ever, the most interesting company on the planet in food, the only company that came out when we did a review for WHO in 2006 of how were the big corporations addressing the global strategy on diet, physical activity and health. Unilever was the only company which had any serious engagement. Derek will probably be relieved, and I hope you don't quote me, Derek, but I think Pepsi is catching up a little bit. We've got the Sustainable Agriculture Initiatives. There's an interesting movement going on in companies, not least because they're panicking, looking 30 years ahead. Governments come and go, but the companies want to be around, not least to service the out-of-control pensions of their chief executives, he says acidly. I hope you're laughing. The new big kid on the block is sustainable intensification, but I'm one who thinks we have to take very seriously the equivalent of what the 1930s thinkers did, whole systems change. And there's very interesting movements. You and IFPRI, I think, play an honorable part in that thinking. I think the IASTD report has been a significant contribution to that. Now, this is a terrible slide. You can look at it later, and I apologize for it, but I don't. It's from my last report as a government commissioner a couple of 5 months ago. I think in one slide this summarizes what we have to do in the 21st century, what agriculture and food systems have got to address. It's a complicated world of 6 big headings: quality, social, environment, health, economy, and governance. The danger is we're getting policy addressing just some bits of this. the health, middle of the right column, is what the UN meeting is doing, and is not connecting with environment, is not connecting with the economy. What we actually need is to develop a food system which addresses all of this. We could talk for hours about that, and I won't. Now, I'm arguing we are in a messy situation. It's taken 60, 70 years to build the current totally unsustainable food system. I think we've got to be realistic and start planning the big changes over the next 30, 40 years. If you ask me honestly, I think probably only a war will do it. But I don't want that, and I'm sure you don't want that. Meanwhile, we're dealing with patchy, messy, partial, incremental change. So what are we going to do about this in this world? I think the harsh truth is we are dealing with four realities of contemporary governance. The difficulty is food policy is multi-sectoral. It's multi-level. In other words, it's global, regional, continental. Even you in the US have to address NAFTA. In Europe, we're 27 nations now. Britain can't do anything. It's got to be done through the EU. But then we've got down to that local level that you at IFPRI know only so well. This is a complicated world. To talk about UN high-level meetings delivering something, whoa, come on, let's grow up. We've got to have something that addresses all of those levels. The reality is three. Derek and his colleagues are much more important, frankly, than about 80% of the countries on the planet. But they can't resolve this. They cannot resolve it. It's too big, even for Unilever, PepsiCo, and everything. They can do brand protection. They can do very interesting work beneath the radar, but they can't resolve this unsustainability of the food system. And the fundamental problem, I think, is that health as a lobby is very weak, which is why from the moment you and IFPRI have started talking about public health, Marie knows this, I tried to help in a little way. We're very committed to people like you, the legacy of the 1970s crisis, the CGIAR policy bit bolted on to the others, the productionist bits of CGIAR. We've got to really get better organized as a health and agriculture and food movement. So I'm nearly there. My messages to you in IFPRI are we've got to stop thinking farming. You're not going to like that, but that's what I think. We've got to think sustainable food systems, not farming. We've got to have more emphasis on consumption. Consumers are part of the problem. No company is going to attack its consumers, but rich consumers in the West are part of the problem. They're the elephant in the room, and physically they're getting rather like elephants. We've got to think more on plants, less on meat and dairy. I think you and IFPRI have been much too kind about the meat revolution. I think we've got to focus much more about waste. Some of the big NGOs, WWF, and people have done really interesting work showing that actually the demand to increase, that FAO says we've got to increase food production by 70% by 2050. It's not true, actually. If the rich British can do with not having 30,000 food items in their supermarket, but actually less, which would be good for their health, there's a lot more food that can be shared elsewhere. So, but it's tricky around prices. The West has got used, and the East and the South, the developing world, use whatever moniker you like, they're getting hooked into cheap food as being the way forward, and what that's done is externalize costs onto the environment, and we know the healthcare costs that the West is doing. Even rich US, rich Europe can't afford the NCD burdens. Wow, can the developing world? They can't. So there's a wake-up call here to the developing world. Don't do what the West has done. We have to take that complicated polyvalue approach to food systems I was giving. You can look at that again afterwards. I'll leave it. Essentially, I'm saying I think we need a shift in thinking away from focus on the farm, focus on producing more, to thinking about what do human bodies need, and then what do we want farmers to produce for them. And that will require very different thinking. It'll mean definitely a shift away from the assumption of meat and dairy, and much more focus upon plant production. Plants at the middle of the farm, plants in the middle of the plate. It's that sort of thinking. And currently, current policy discourse is too focused on production. The UN high-level meeting, in other words, is a moment, a pause moment I've written here. It's good, but frankly, it's already getting cut up with the inevitable lobbying. But I see this as a 30-year project now. We know enough what the problem is. If we want to get evidence, policy, and practice into integration, as opposed to divorce or mismatch, wow, have we got some serious work to do. Thanks.